Hi, this evening we're going to do Machen chapter 5. Machen chapter 5 is very similar to chapter 4 in the sense that we're doing nouns. So nouns basically have four functions: as the subject doing the action, as the object receiving the action, as an indirect object or recipient when they're receiving a transfer of giving, showing, or telling, or possession when they're possessing something. So in this case, this chapter is going to be very similar to the previous chapter. Now, the only difference is that we're going to be dealing with feminine, grammatically feminine nouns that end in the vowels alpha or eta, as opposed to grammatically masculine and neuter nouns. But their functions of subject, of owner, of recipient, and object are going to be the same. Now, when you look at a typical feminine noun of the first declension. The first declension is this group of nouns that are feminine. They're going to all end in alpha or eta. The basic endings that change, so you know what functions they perform, are going to be like this. I'll take a simple two-syllable feminine, grammatically feminine noun, hora, which means hour, where we get our English word hour, H-O-U-R. So the declension or the ending changes would be hora, horas, hora with a little subscript underneath it, horan, those are the singulars. Hora, horas, hora, horan. And then in the plurals, horai, horon, horais, and horas. Again, I'll do the whole thing. Hora, horas, hora, horan, plural. Horai, horon, horais, horas. Now, there's just a couple things to recognize about these feminine nouns, one of which is the same as we've seen with masculine and neuters, and two things that are different. The thing that is the same is that when you have a noun that's accented on number one, the ending accent, the very last stress point of the noun, you'll find that it has a circumflex on the very, very last syllable of the genitive and dative singular and the genitive and dative plural. An example of this would be on the second page when you have a word like graphe. The paradigm would be graphe, graphes, graphe, graphane, graphi, graphone, graphis, and graphas. In the genitive and dative, singular and plural, you'll find a circumflex. It's a little bit hard to see unless you're actually looking at the book. But let me just talk about two things that are unique to feminine nouns, Greek feminine nouns of the first declension. When you run through the plural table, graphi, graphone, graphis, graphas, you will find that no matter where the starting accent is, in the genitive plural, this own ending, it'll have a circumflex on the last syllable. That's true whether it starts off on any other different stress point. In the genitive plural, these feminine nouns always have a circumflex on the last syllable. Let me just say something else about whether the endings maintain an alpha or an eta. There's something that we call the air rule to understand this, and I'll just kind of give it to you like this. That if you have a feminine noun that ends in an eta, the singular endings will always have an eta all the way through. For instance, graphe, graphes, graphe, and graphane. It always has eta, 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 eta. Now, if you happen to have a noun ending with an alpha, like hora, the very first one that I gave, if you snip off that A, and right before that A, if you have the letters epsilon, iota, or rho, like hora, if I snip off that A right before it's a rho, you'll have alphas all the way down. Hora, horas, hora, hora. If it starts with an eta, you'll have etas all the way down. Graphe, graphes, graphe, graphane. If you snip off that A, though, if it ends with an A and you snip it off, and right before it you have an epsilon, iota, or rho, you'll have alphas all the way down. Hora, horas, hora, hora. The one little different thing is that if you have any other type of noun, if it ends with an A and you snip off that A, and right before it you have any other letter except an epsilon, iota, or rho, like xi, for instance. Take the feminine noun doxa. Snip off the A, you have xi. It's not an epsilon, iota, or rho. So what you have is you have an A in the nominative, an A in the accusative, and number 2 and 3 position you have an eta. For instance, if I took doxa, it would go doxa, doxes, doxe, doxon. You start with an alpha, you have 2 etas, and you have an alpha again. Doxa, doxes, doxe, doxon. The plurals are unaffected. If you understand these things, feminine Greek nouns ending in alpha and eta, if you understand that, If you understand that stress-wise, the genitive plural always has a circumflex on the last syllable, and you understand this air rule. Start off with an eta, you have eta is always in the singular. Start off with an alpha, right before it with an epsilon, iota, or rho, you have all alphas. Anything else, you have an alpha, eta, and alpha in the nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. That's it, Machen chapter 5.